Princess Lyria's pointed ears flushed deep crimson with shock and outrage as she processed her father's words, the crystalline blue patterns of her skin shifting to angry silvers that made her emotional state unmistakable to anyone familiar with Zelhari physiology. She stood in the imperial throne room where countless generations of her ancestors had ruled with wisdom and dignity, but today felt like the death of everything she'd been taught to value about Zelhari civilization. A human, she repeated, her voice carrying the kind of horrified disbelief reserved for the most unthinkable propositions. Father, you want me to marry a human? Emperor Thalen's own emotional patterns showed deep blues of sorrow mixed with the golds of desperate determination as he faced his daughter's rebellion. Lyria, the marriage alliance with Ambassador Connor Mitchell represents our people's best hope for economic survival and technological advancement. The Zelhari Empire can no longer afford the luxury of isolation. Luxury of isolation? Lyria's ears practically vibrated with indignation. Father, you're talking about abandoning 3,000 years of Zelhari cultural purity for a trade agreement with beings who've barely achieved interstellar travel. I'm talking about adapting to galactic realities that don't care about our cultural purity, Emperor Thalen replied with the weariness of someone who'd spent months wrestling with impossible choices. The other empires have moved beyond us, Lyria. Our economy is stagnating, our technology is obsolete, and our young people are emigrating to societies that offer opportunities we can't provide. Lyria paced the throne room with agitated grace, her crystalline skin patterns cycling through colors that indicated deep emotional turmoil. So your solution is to contaminate our bloodlines with human genetics and abandon the traditions that have made us who we are? My solution is to prevent our civilization from becoming a historical curiosity that younger species study in their museums, Emperor Thalen said firmly. The humans are offering technological partnership, trade agreements, and cultural exchange that could revitalize our empire. At the cost of marrying your daughter to one of them, Lyria said bitterly. Father, I'll marry anyone but the human. Choose any noble from any of the great houses, arrange an alliance with the Centaurian Confederacy, negotiate with the Vegan Trade Consortium, anything but forcing me to spend my life bound to someone whose species considers us quaint relics of a bygone age. The humans don't consider us quaint relics, Emperor Thalen corrected gently. Ambassador Mitchell has spent considerable time studying our culture and expressing genuine appreciation for Zelhari achievements in art, philosophy, and spiritual development. Appreciation, Lyria repeated with scorn. How generous of him to appreciate us while his people surpass us in every area that matters for survival in the modern galaxy. Emperor Thalen activated a holographic display that showed economic projections, population statistics, and technological assessments that painted a grim picture of Zelhari decline. Lyria, look at these figures objectively. Our empire is dying slowly, and our traditional approaches to governance and economics are accelerating that decline. Then we'll find traditional solutions, Lyria insisted, though privately she was beginning to understand the scope of their crisis. Our ancestors faced challenges before and overcame them without abandoning their principles. Our ancestors never faced competition from species that could innovate faster than we could adapt, Emperor Thalen pointed out. The humans have achieved in 3 centuries what took us millennia, and they're offering to share that capability with us. In exchange for political control through marriage alliance, Lyria said accusingly. In exchange for partnership between equals, Emperor Thalen corrected. Ambassador Mitchell has been quite clear that the proposed alliance is intended to benefit both civilizations, not to establish human dominance over Zelhari territories. And you believe him? Lyria asked incredulously. I believe the alternative is watching our people slowly fade into irrelevance while we cling to traditions that no longer serve their intended purpose, Emperor Thalen replied with painful honesty. Lyria felt her emotional patterns shifting to the deep purples that indicated conflicted loyalties as she struggled to balance her father's logic against her visceral rejection of everything he was proposing. Father, even if the political necessity is real, why must it be me? Why can't you arrange a different kind of alliance that doesn't require sacrificing your daughter's future to human ambitions? Because Ambassador Mitchell specifically requested marriage alliance as the foundation of the partnership, Emperor Thalen admitted. And because he specifically requested you as his intended bride. He requested me. Lyria's patterns flared with new outrage. This human has the arrogance to request a specific Zelhari princess for his political convenience. He requested you because he studied our culture enough to understand that any meaningful alliance must be built on genuine commitment rather than mere convenience, Emperor Thalen explained. He believes that marriage to someone of your intelligence and political understanding would create the kind of personal bond necessary for lasting cooperation between our peoples. How thoughtful of him to analyze the political usefulness of marrying me, Lyria said with bitter sarcasm. I'm sure his detailed study of my qualifications had nothing to do with calculating how to most effectively manipulate Zelhari leadership. Lyria, Emperor Thalen said seriously, Ambassador Mitchell has never met you. His request for marriage alliance was based on your reputation for intelligence, cultural knowledge, and commitment to Zelhari welfare. He's not manipulating anyone, he's proposing a solution that could benefit everyone involved. Everyone except me, Lyria pointed out. I'm supposed to sacrifice my freedom, my choice of partner, and my loyalty to Zelhari traditions so that our people can become junior partners in human expansion. You're supposed to help lead our people into a future where Zelhari culture can survive and thrive instead of slowly disappearing, Emperor Thalen corrected. And Ambassador Mitchell is offering to dedicate his life to supporting that goal. Lyria stared at the holographic displays showing the decline of everything she'd been raised to protect and preserve, while her father's words forced her to confront realities she'd been avoiding. Father, what if I refuse? What if I simply won't marry this human regardless of the political consequences? Emperor Thalen's patterns shifted to colors Lyria had never seen from him before, deep, aching sadness mixed with resignation. Then I'll respect your choice and find another way to address our people's crisis, even if that means accepting decline and irrelevance as inevitable. But you believe this marriage alliance is our only hope, Lyria said quietly. I believe it's our best hope, Emperor Thalen confirmed. But I won't force you to sacrifice your happiness for political necessity. The choice must be yours. Lyria felt the weight of her entire civilization's future settling onto her shoulders as she realized that her father was genuinely prepared to let their empire decline rather than force her into an unwanted marriage. When is Ambassador Mitchell arriving for the formal introduction? Tomorrow, Emperor Thalen replied. He's requested a private meeting to discuss the proposed alliance and to allow you both to assess your compatibility before any formal arrangements are finalized. How generous, Lyria said with weary sarcasm. He'll allow me to assess my compatibility with the human I'm expected to marry for the good of our people. Lyria, Emperor Thalen said gently, Ambassador Mitchell is insisting on your consent and comfort with the arrangement. He's made it clear that he has no interest in a marriage alliance with someone who finds the prospect genuinely objectionable. Then he'll be disappointed, Lyria said firmly, because I find the entire prospect not just objectionable but fundamentally wrong. I'll meet with him tomorrow, Father, but only to explain why I'll marry anyone in the galaxy before I'll marry a human. That's your decision to make, Emperor Thalen said sadly. Though I hope you'll at least listen to what he has to say before you reject the possibility entirely. As Lyria left the throne room with her emotional pattern still cycling through colors of anger and determination, she couldn't shake her father's words about Zelhari decline and the necessity of adaptation. But her loyalty to everything she'd been taught about their people's superiority and cultural purity made the thought of marriage to a human feel like betrayal of everything that made Zelhari civilization worth preserving. Tomorrow, she muttered to herself as she prepared to meet the human who thought he could solve their problems through marriage alliance, I'll make it very clear that some things are more important than political convenience. But even as she said it, Lyria couldn't entirely ignore the nagging question of whether her father might be right about the consequences of choosing traditional pride over practical survival. Princess Lyria entered the diplomatic reception chamber wearing her most formal court attire and a kind of expression that had intimidated visiting dignitaries for years, her pointed ears set at angles that broadcast hostility to anyone familiar with Zelhari emotional signals. She had spent the morning preparing for this encounter by reviewing every offensive tactic she could employ to demonstrate her complete unsuitability as a bride, confident that no human would want to marry someone actively committed to making his life miserable. Ambassador Connor Mitchell stood as she entered, and Lyria's first surprise was that he looked nothing like the crude opportunist she'd been expecting. Tall and lean with intelligent dark eyes and an expression of genuine respect, he bowed in perfect accordance with Zelhari diplomatic protocol, a gesture that indicated either careful preparation or natural courtesy that didn't fit her assumptions about human arrogance. "Your Highness," Connor said in flawless Zelhari, his pronunciation carrying only the slightest accent. "I'm honored by your willingness to meet with me despite the unusual circumstances that bring us together." Lyria felt her prepared hostility falter slightly at hearing her own language spoken with obvious care and respect, but she quickly recovered her antagonistic composure. "Ambassador Mitchell, I agreed to this meeting so that I could explain personally why I find the proposed marriage alliance completely unacceptable." "I appreciate your directness," Connor replied with calm that seemed genuine rather than diplomatic. "And I should clarify that I share your reservations about arranged marriages between strangers, regardless of their political utility." "You share my reservations?" Lyria repeated, confused by his response. "Then why did you propose this arrangement?" "I didn't propose it," Connor corrected gently. "I agreed to consider it when your father approached human diplomatic channels about the possibility of marriage alliance. But I made it clear that any such arrangement would require your genuine consent and enthusiasm, not just political compliance." Lyria's emotional patterns flickered with uncertainty as Connor's response undermined her strategy of aggressive rejection. "You're saying you don't want to marry me?" "I'm saying I don't want to marry anyone who finds the prospect objectionable," Connor replied with a slight smile that seemed directed at the absurdity of their situation rather than at her personally. "Forced marriages benefit no one, and they certainly don't create the kind of personal bonds that could support lasting political alliance." "Then we agree that this entire arrangement is inappropriate," Lyria said, though she felt oddly disappointed by his apparent lack of interest in pursuing their engagement. "We agree that marriage without mutual affection and respect would be inappropriate," Connor clarified. "Whether this particular arrangement falls into that category depends on whether we prove compatible during the time we spend getting to know each other." Lyria realized that Connor was treating their introduction as the beginning of courtship rather than the formality preceding arranged marriage, which created complications for her strategy of deliberate unpleasantness. "Ambassador Mitchell, I should be clear that I have no intention of developing affection or respect for someone whose species I consider fundamentally incompatible with Zelhari values." "That's certainly your prerogative," Connor agreed cheerfully. "Though I'm curious about which Zelhari values you believe humans lack." "All of them," Lyria said with conviction that was only slightly undermined by Connor's obvious familiarity with Zelhari culture. "Humans are young, aggressive, and focused on material advancement rather than spiritual development." "Interesting assessment," Connor said thoughtfully. "Could you help me understand how you've reached those conclusions about human character and values?" "Through observation of human behavior throughout the galaxy," Lyria replied, though privately she realized that most of her observations were second-hand accounts filtered through Zelhari cultural prejudices. "Your species expands rapidly, exploits resources aggressively, and treats other civilizations as obstacles to overcome rather than partners to learn from." "Some humans certainly behave that way," Connor acknowledged without defensiveness. "Just as some Zelhari isolate themselves from galactic society and treat younger species as culturally inferior rather than different." Lyria felt her patterns shift with irritation at having her own people's prejudices turned back on her. "The Zelhari have spent millennia developing philosophical and artistic achievements that transcend material concerns. Which is precisely why I'm interested in this alliance," Connor said with enthusiasm that seemed completely genuine. "Zelhari contributions to galactic culture in the areas of aesthetic theory, spiritual development, and philosophical inquiry are remarkable. I've spent months studying your people's achievements and hoping for opportunities to learn from them directly." "Months studying our achievements?" Lyria repeated, surprised by the extent of his preparation. "Your artistic traditions alone represent thousands of years of creative innovation," Connor explained, activating a personal display that showed extensive notes about Zelhari cultural history. "The integration of emotion and crystalline resonance in your sculptural work, the mathematical precision of your musical compositions, the philosophical frameworks underlying your governmental structures. All of it demonstrates intellectual sophistication that human civilization could benefit from understanding. Lyria stared at Connor's research notes, recognizing references to obscure Zelhari texts and artistic movements that most of her own people wouldn't have known about. You've been studying our culture for months. Since the possibility of marriage alliance was first suggested, Connor confirmed. I wanted to understand not just Zelhari customs and traditions, but the deeper values and perspectives that shaped your civilization. And what conclusions have you reached? Lyria asked, despite herself curious about his perspective on her people. That the Zelhari have achieved remarkable balance between individual expression and social harmony, that your approaches to conflict resolution and community decision-making offer models that other civilizations could learn from, and that your integration of spiritual and practical concerns represents wisdom that human society often lacks, Connor said with obvious respect. Lyria felt her hostility wavering as she processed Connor's genuine appreciation for aspects of Zelhari culture that she'd never heard outsiders acknowledge, let alone understand. Most other species view our traditions as outdated or impractical. Most other species haven't taken time to understand what those traditions accomplish, Connor replied. Your emphasis on emotional transparency through physiological response creates social dynamics that prevent many of the miscommunications and conflicts that plague other civilizations. You've studied our emotional expression patterns? Lyria asked, suddenly aware that her own patterns had been broadcasting her responses throughout their conversation. Basic principles only, Connor assured her. Enough to avoid giving unintended offense, but not enough to interpret complex emotional states without permission. Lyria realized that Connor had been carefully avoiding any reference to her obvious emotional responses despite his knowledge of Zelhari physiology, a courtesy that demonstrated more cultural sensitivity than she'd expected from any outsider. Why are you so interested in learning about our people? Because isolation has costs for both our civilizations, Connor replied seriously. Humans tend to focus on technological and economic advancement without developing the philosophical frameworks necessary for using those advances wisely. Zelhari culture offers perspectives on community, spirituality, and long-term thinking that could help humanity avoid some of the mistakes that rapid expansion tends to create. And what would humans offer the Zelhari in return? Lyria asked, though she was beginning to suspect she already knew the answer. Technological capabilities that could help Zelhari culture spread beyond your traditional territories, economic partnerships that could support artistic and philosophical pursuits without requiring material compromise, and exposure to different approaches to problem-solving that might complement your existing traditions, Connor explained. Lyria found herself genuinely considering Connor's arguments rather than simply rejecting them, which created uncomfortable questions about her preconceptions regarding human motivations and capabilities. Ambassador Mitchell, assuming our peoples could benefit from cultural exchange, why does that exchange require marriage alliance? Because meaningful cultural integration requires personal commitment that goes beyond formal treaties, Connor said with conviction that made his emotional patterns seem as transparent as those of any Zelhari. Marriage creates bonds between individuals that can survive political changes and economic fluctuations. Personal commitment, Lyria repeated thoughtfully. You're talking about genuine emotional investment in the success of the alliance. I'm talking about two people choosing to build a life together that demonstrates the possibility of successful integration between our civilizations, Connor clarified. Though obviously, that only works if both people are genuinely committed to the attempt. Lyria realized that Connor was describing marriage as partnership rather than political arrangement, which challenged her assumptions about his motivations while creating new concerns about her own responses to his apparent sincerity. And you believe we could develop that kind of personal commitment? I believe we could discover whether such commitment is possible, Connor replied carefully. If you're willing to spend time getting to know each other without predetermined conclusions about compatibility. Without predetermined conclusions, Lyria said with a slight smile that surprised her. You mean I should stop assuming you're a crude opportunist, and you should stop assuming I'm a reasonable person who makes decisions based on evidence rather than prejudice. Something like that, Connor agreed with returning smile that made him look considerably more attractive than Lyria was comfortable acknowledging. As their meeting concluded with agreements to continue conversations over the following weeks, Lyria found herself walking back to her quarters with emotional patterns that indicated confusion and unwilling interest rather than the triumphant hostility she'd planned to display after rejecting Connor's suit. "This is not going according to plan," she muttered to herself, reviewing Connor's unexpected combination of cultural knowledge, genuine respect, and apparent sincerity about the purposes of their potential marriage. But even as she tried to maintain her resistance to the arrangement, Lyria couldn't entirely dismiss the possibility that Connor Mitchell might be exactly the kind of partner who could help both their people. Princess Lyria entered the diplomatic reception chamber wearing her most formal court attire and the kind. 3 months into what had begun as formal courtship protocols and evolved into something Lyria refused to acknowledge as genuine attraction, she found herself in the palace gardens with Connor reviewing plans for a cultural exchange program that combined Zelhari artistic traditions with human technological capabilities. Her emotional patterns had been cycling through dangerous territories lately, warm golds of affection mixed with the deep purples of internal conflict that indicated her growing feelings were challenging everything she'd been taught about proper Zelhari behavior. "The holographic sculpture integration is remarkable," Connor was saying as they examined prototypes that used human projection technology to enhance traditional Zelhari crystalline art forms. "Your artists are creating experiences that engage viewers on levels we never considered possible. Human projection technology makes it possible to share emotional resonance across species barriers," Lyria acknowledged, though admitting the value of human innovation still felt like betraying her people's traditional pride. "Artists who couldn't communicate their work to non-Zelhari audiences before can now create universal emotional experiences. Which benefits everyone involved," Connor observed with the enthusiasm that Lyria had learned was his genuine response to successful cultural collaboration. Zelhari artists gain broader audiences for their work, while other species gain access to forms of emotional expression they couldn't experience otherwise. Lyria watched Connor's face as he studied the artistic prototypes, noting the genuine appreciation in his expression and the careful attention he paid to understanding not just the technical aspects but the cultural significance of what they were creating together. Over the past months, she'd been forced to acknowledge that Connor's interest in Zelhari culture went far beyond diplomatic necessity into something that looked remarkably like love for the philosophical and artistic achievements her people had spent millennia developing. "Connor," she said carefully, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course," he replied, giving her the kind of complete attention that had become one of the most appealing aspects of their time together. "Why are you really here?" Lyria asked. "Not the diplomatic reasons or the political advantages, but your personal motivations for agreeing to this arrangement." Connor considered the question while they walked through gardens that combined traditional Zelhari landscaping with subtle technological enhancements that created environments more beautiful than either culture could have achieved alone. "Initially, because I believed the alliance could benefit both our peoples," he said finally. "But increasingly, because I've discovered that spending time with you and learning about your culture has become the most meaningful work I've ever done." "Meaningful how?" Lyria pressed, though his answer was already making her emotional patterns shift in ways that she hoped he couldn't interpret. "Your perspective on community responsibility, your approaches to balancing individual expression with social harmony, your understanding of how aesthetic and spiritual concerns can inform practical decisions," Connor explained with obvious sincerity. "Working with you has changed how I think about leadership, relationships, and what civilization should accomplish." Lyria felt warmth spreading through her patterns as she processed Connor's words, while simultaneously fighting the terrifying recognition that his presence had become equally meaningful to her. "You're saying that the alliance has become personally important to you." "I'm saying that you've become personally important to me," Connor corrected gently. "The alliance matters because it could help both our peoples, but you matter because you've helped me become a better person than I was when I arrived." "A better person how?" Lyria asked, though she was afraid she already knew what he was going to say. "More thoughtful about the consequences of rapid change, more appreciative of wisdom that develops slowly over generations, more committed to building bridges rather than simply pursuing advantages," Connor said with the kind of honesty that made Lyria's resistance to their relationship increasingly difficult to maintain. "Connor," Lyria said quietly, "what we're developing between us, it's not just political convenience anymore, is it?" "Not for me," Connor confirmed, stopping their walk to face her directly. Is it still just political necessity for you? Lyria looked at him standing among flowers that bloomed with bioluminescent patterns that responded to Zelhari emotional states, his expression carrying hope mixed with patient acceptance of whatever answer she might give. Over the past months, Connor had never pushed for more affection than she was willing to offer, never assumed privileges their engagement might theoretically grant him, and never treated her as anything other than an equal partner whose opinions and feelings mattered more than political expedience. No, she admitted, her patterns brightening with colors that indicated deep emotional connection. It stopped being just political necessity weeks ago. And how do you feel about that? Connor asked carefully. Terrified, Lyria said honestly. My entire life, I've been taught that Zelhari cultural purity depends on maintaining distance from younger species. Falling in love with you feels like betraying everything my people have spent millennia preserving. What if, Connor suggested gently, loving me actually represents the evolution of Zelhari values rather than their betrayal? What if your people's wisdom about community and harmony can extend beyond species boundaries? Lyria felt her patterns cycling through rapid changes as she processed the implications of Connor's question. You're suggesting that genuine Zelhari principles support the kind of alliance we're building. I'm suggesting that the best of Zelhari culture, your emphasis on understanding, your commitment to long-term thinking, your integration of emotional and practical concerns, all of it supports building bridges rather than maintaining barriers, Connor explained. But the traditionalists in our court argue that any close association with humans will dilute what makes Zelhari civilization unique, Lyria pointed out, voicing concerns that had been troubling her despite her growing feelings for Connor. Are you less Zelhari because you've learned to appreciate human technological capabilities? Connor asked. Am I less human because I've come to value Zelhari approaches to community and spirituality? No, Lyria admitted. If anything, I feel more authentically Zelhari when I'm working with you because you help me see the value in our traditions that I'd started taking for granted. Then maybe the traditionalists are wrong about cultural contamination, Connor suggested. Maybe the real threat to Zelhari culture comes from isolation rather than engagement. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of one of Lyria's personal guards carrying a message from Emperor Thalen requesting their immediate presence in the throne room. As they walked toward the palace, Lyria felt growing apprehension about what her father might want to discuss with both of them. Princess Lyria, Ambassador Mitchell, Emperor Thalen greeted them with patterns that indicated serious concern mixed with determination. I've received communications from the Council of Noble Houses regarding your engagement. What kind of communications? Lyria asked, though she suspected the answer would be troubling. Formal objections to the marriage alliance based on concerns about cultural contamination and the precedent of close association with non-Zelhari species, Emperor Thalen explained grimly. Several prominent families are threatening to withdraw support for the imperial government if the marriage proceeds. They're threatening political rebellion over my personal choices? Lyria asked with growing anger. They're threatening political instability over what they see as fundamental changes to Zelhari cultural identity, Emperor Thalen corrected. And they've demanded that Ambassador Mitchell undergo the traditional challenges that would demonstrate his worthiness to marry into Zelhari nobility. Traditional challenges? Connor asked carefully. Physical and intellectual contests that historically proved a suitor's capability to protect and provide for a Zelhari princess, Emperor Thalen explained with obvious reluctance. Challenges designed for Zelhari physiology and cultural knowledge that would be extremely difficult for any outsider to successfully complete. Lyria felt her patterns flaring with protective anger as she realized that the noble houses were essentially trying to force Connor into situations where failure would be inevitable. Father, those challenges haven't been required for centuries, and they were never intended to exclude qualified suitors based on species differences. Nevertheless, the Council has invoked their traditional right to demand proof of worthiness before accepting a non-Zelhari marriage into the imperial family, Emperor Thalen said sadly. And they've made it clear that Ambassador Mitchell's failure to meet the challenges would justify their opposition to the entire alliance. What kind of challenges are we talking about? Connor asked with calm that Lyria found both admirable and terrifying. Combat trials, cultural examinations, and demonstrations of leadership capability, Emperor Thalen listed with growing reluctance. All designed to test characteristics that Zelhari evolution and culture have specifically developed over millions of years. So they're setting me up to fail in order to justify rejecting the alliance, Connor observed with diplomatic understanding of the political dynamics involved. That appears to be their intention, Emperor Thalen confirmed. Lyria looked at Connor, seeing determination mixed with realistic assessment of the challenges he would face, and realized that she was watching someone prepare to risk his life for the possibility of building a future together. Connor, she said quietly, you don't have to do this. We could find other ways to build the alliance that don't require you to prove yourself to people who've already decided you're unworthy. Could we? Connor asked seriously. Or would any alternative arrangement be seen as weakness that undermines both the alliance and your position as someone who chose love over tradition? Lyria felt her emotional patterns shifting to colors she'd never experienced before as she understood that Connor was willing to face potentially lethal challenges not just for political alliance but for the chance to spend his life with her. The challenges begin tomorrow, Emperor Thalen announced. Ambassador Mitchell, are you prepared to demonstrate your worthiness to marry my daughter? I'm prepared to prove that love transcends species boundaries, Connor replied with quiet confidence, and that the best of both our cultures can create something stronger than either could achieve alone. As they left the throne room to prepare for trials that would test everything Connor had learned about Zelhari culture while potentially exposing him to dangers that human physiology might not survive, Lyria realized that her choice was no longer between marriage and freedom, but between the safety of traditional isolation and the courage to fight for love that could transform both their peoples. 6 months after Princess Lyria had declared she would marry anyone but the human, she stood before the assembled Zelhari nobility wearing the ceremonial robes of a bride who had chosen love over tradition, while Connor waited at the altar in formal attire that combined human diplomatic dress with Zelhari cultural elements that honored both their heritages. The months between the traditional challenges and their wedding had transformed not just their personal relationship but the political landscape of both their civilizations. The traditional challenges that were supposed to prove Connor's unworthiness had instead demonstrated his remarkable understanding of Zelhari culture and his genuine commitment to building bridges between their peoples. His success in the intellectual examinations, despite never having formal Zelhari education, had surprised even his supporters, while his creative solutions to the leadership trials had impressed nobles who had expected him to fail spectacularly. When I first heard about this arrangement, Lyria said during the ceremony that was being broadcast throughout both human and Zelhari space, I was convinced that marrying Connor would represent betrayal of everything I'd been taught to value about our culture and traditions. The assembled nobility, many of whom had initially opposed the marriage, listened with attention that reflected months of observing how the alliance had already begun benefiting their people. The cultural exchange programs Connor and Lyria had developed were creating opportunities for Zelhari artists and philosophers that had revitalized their economy, while human technological innovations were solving infrastructure problems that had plagued them for decades. What I discovered, Lyria continued, her emotional patterns displaying the warm golds and deep blues that indicated profound love and commitment, is that Connor understands and appreciates Zelhari values better than many of our own people. His respect for our traditions, combined with his insights from human experience, has helped me see our culture not as something to preserve in isolation but as something to share and strengthen through genuine partnership. Connor's response during the ceremony reflected the transformation in his own understanding over the months they'd spent building their relationship. Lyria taught me that true cultural alliance isn't about one civilization dominating another, but about two peoples choosing to learn from each other while maintaining what makes each unique and valuable. Emperor Thalen, officiating at the ceremony that represented both personal union and political alliance, addressed the broader implications of what they were witnessing. This marriage represents the evolution of Zelhari civilization rather than its abandonment. Princess Lyria and Ambassador Mitchell have demonstrated that our people can engage with the galaxy while strengthening rather than compromising the values that define us. The ceremony itself reflected the cultural integration that Connor and Lyria had been developing throughout their engagement. Traditional Zelhari elements, the crystalline resonance chambers that amplified emotional connection, the artistic displays that chronicled their people's history, the philosophical declarations that established their commitment to community welfare, were enhanced by human innovations that allowed their vows to be shared with family members across multiple star systems and translated into forms that could be understood by dozens of different species. The challenges we faced from the Council of Noble Houses, Lyria said during the personal vows that followed the formal political declarations, taught us both that love worth having is love worth fighting for. Connor's willingness to risk his life proving his commitment to our people showed me that true loyalty sometimes requires challenging the very traditions we're trying to protect. And Lyria's courage in standing with me against her own people's initial opposition, Connor added, demonstrated that the strongest cultural values are those that can evolve and adapt while maintaining their essential principles. The noble houses that had initially opposed the marriage were now among its strongest supporters, having witnessed how Connor's integration into Zelhari society had brought benefits that exceeded their most optimistic projections for traditional alliances. The economic partnerships he'd negotiated had created prosperity that allowed increased support for artistic and philosophical pursuits, while the technological innovations he'd helped implement had solved practical problems without compromising Zelhari aesthetic or spiritual values. 6 months ago, said Lady Thera of House Crystalline, one of the most traditional noble families, I believed this marriage would represent the end of authentic Zelhari culture. Instead, I've watched Princess Lyria and Ambassador Mitchell create new possibilities for our people that honor our past while building our future. The wedding celebration that followed the ceremony showcased the successful integration of human and Zelhari capabilities in ways that enhanced both cultures. Traditional Zelhari music was enhanced by human harmonic technologies that allowed emotional resonance to be shared across species boundaries, while human culinary traditions were adapted using Zelhari ingredients and preparation methods that created entirely new aesthetic experiences. What we've built together, Lyria said during the reception where their guests included representatives from dozens of civilizations who had come to observe what many considered a model for successful interspecies alliance, proves that the galaxy is large enough for different peoples to maintain their unique identities while creating new possibilities through cooperation. The alliance between our civilizations, Connor added, has taught both our peoples that strength comes not from isolation or dominance, but from the courage to build bridges based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Emperor Thalen's speech during the celebration reflected his pride in his daughter's choice and his recognition that her marriage represented exactly the kind of leadership their people needed for the challenges ahead. Princess Lyria chose love over prejudice, partnership over isolation, and courage over tradition for its own sake. In doing so, she has shown us all that the greatest acts of loyalty sometimes require changing the very things we're trying to preserve. As the celebration continued into the evening with entertainment that showcased the artistic collaboration between human and Zelhari cultures, Lyria and Connor found themselves alone for a few moments in the gardens where they'd first acknowledged their growing feelings for each other. Any regrets about marrying the human your father tried to foist on you? Connor asked with the humor that had helped them navigate the political and personal challenges of their unconventional courtship. Only that it took me so long to realize what an extraordinary man my father had chosen for me, Lyria replied, her patterns glowing with contentment and deep affection. Though I suspect he knew exactly what he was doing when he arranged this political necessity. You think Emperor Thalen was matchmaking rather than just alliance building? Connor asked. I think my father is wise enough to understand that the strongest political partnerships are built on genuine personal connections, Lyria said thoughtfully. And patient enough to let us discover that connection ourselves rather than forcing it. As they looked out over the celebration that honored both their love and the successful alliance it represented, Connor and Lyria understood that their marriage had become something far more significant than either had originally anticipated. They had proven that love could transcend species boundaries, that traditions could evolve without losing their essential meaning, and that the greatest strength came from choosing cooperation over conflict. What happens now? Connor asked as they watched their people celebrating together in ways that would have been unthinkable just months before. Now we build the future we've started, Lyria replied with confidence that reflected her transformation from reluctant princess to committed leader. We show the galaxy that different civilizations can work together without losing what makes them unique, and we raise children who understand that diversity is strength rather than threat. Children? Connor asked with obvious delight at the prospect. Eventually, Lyria said with patterns that indicated both excitement and nervous anticipation. Though I suspect our children will face interesting challenges growing up as symbols of interspecies cooperation. They'll also have the advantage of parents who understand that love transcends any barrier when it's based on genuine respect and mutual commitment, Connor pointed out. As they returned to their celebration, surrounded by family and friends from both their peoples who had learned to see their marriage not as political compromise but as proof that the galaxy's future lay in cooperation rather than competition, Lyria reflected on how completely her understanding of duty, love, and loyalty had been transformed by choosing to see Connor as a person rather than a symbol of everything she'd been taught to reject. Father was right, she said to Connor as they danced to music that combined human and Zelhari traditions in ways that created something entirely new and beautiful. Sometimes the greatest acts of loyalty require the courage to change the very traditions we're trying to preserve. And sometimes, Connor replied, the most unexpected love turns out to be exactly what both peoples needed to discover their own strength. Their dance continued as their celebration evolved into a symbol of what could be accomplished when different worlds chose to build bridges rather than barriers, proving that love could indeed conquer any obstacle when it was based on mutual respect, genuine understanding, and the courage to grow beyond the limitations that tradition sometimes imposed on possibility itself.